I would like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting, working, and thinking together on Wajah country of the Noongar people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And it's not often that I get to do acknowledgements of country these days, so yeah, it's good to be back on country. As Katie said, I'm Jess Perriam. I'm at the IT University of Copenhagen. And when Katie asked me to do an ACAT today, I kind of thought, what do I most want to share and what excites me most about what I'm doing at the moment? And I thought I would talk about the ETHOS Lab, which is a student-facing lab in the Department of Business IT at the IT University of Copenhagen. So just to give you a bit of an outline of what I hope to cover in the next little while, and I don't think I'll take a full hour to get through this presentation today, so I'm very welcome to opening it up for discussion a little bit. Just wanted to give a little bit of a context and history of the lab and talk a little bit about our theoretical underpinnings, and then talk a little bit about research-based teaching and the role that it plays at ITU more broadly, and how the labs kind of feed into that. Then I wanted to talk about what we do as faculty within the lab, because while it is a student-facing lab, the ETHOS Lab is a really good place for faculty to experiment and think about our role as social scientists and humanities practitioners in a university which is very focused on IT. Then some projects and collaborations and where we want to go to in the future. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about ITU with the aid of some clip art. So ITU is quite a small university. We have 3.5 departments. Most people say 3 departments, but within our digital design department, we do have a games section, which does some really important work. The bulk of the work done at ITU is in computer science, and I belong, and the ETHOS Lab belongs to the miscellaneous part of the ITU triangle called Business IT, which is basically social scientists, humanities, and some information systems colleagues as well. We have just under 3,000 students in 2021, 500 full-time employees. We're across 2 buildings, which makes being on campus at Curtin quite exciting. Like the car park is bigger than our entire campus. ITU was established in 1999, so quite a young university, and we're also Denmark's smallest university. And in theory, the ITU triangle, I tried to find the actual version of the triangle online. We're meant to all kind of meet in the middle and collaborate across these 3 departments, and I think it's a reflection of the IT and computing industry a little bit, that these kind of areas feed into one another, but there are also kind of conflicts and opportunities for interventions and provocations to happen as well. So at ITU, we have labs that sit under the Dean of Education, and most departments have 2 to 3 labs that come out of them. So in the ETHOS Lab, we are based more out of the social sciences side of business IT, and then we have the Build Lab, which is a more data science-y, quantitative lab, which tries to build connections with industry. And these other labs that I've got on the slide are some of the labs that ETHOS collaborates with. So we have the Air Lab, which is kind of a design-led, kind of materials-based lab where students can come and build things. And the IXD Lab is more around interaction design. But some of our work intersects with that. And in terms of funding, there is a separate pot of funding from departmental funding. So it's funded independently from departments. A bit of background about the ETHOS Lab. It was established 7 years ago. And these are the people who work directly in the lab. We have a few other faculty who are members of the lab, but my PowerPoint skills aren't great enough to include them all on this slide. So there's myself and Marissa Cohen as heads of lab, with Rachel Douglas-Jones on leave at the moment. Our lab manager, Henrietta Fries, has just joined us in April, and she's just finished a master's in design and sustainability at Aalto University in Finland, and she's brought a lot of new energy to us. Then we have Mase Oyala, who is our technician who runs all of the digital methods side of the lab. And then we have Edith Anderson, who runs our Python study group, which I'll talk about in a little while. And Luis is just finishing up as our lab assistant, doing work on our solar-powered website server, which I can also talk about a bit later. So the lab was actually had its origins in an MSc unit, which we still run today, called Navigating Complexity, or we just shorten it to NavCom because why say the entire thing? And I'll talk a little bit about that unit in a little while because it's quite pivotal to the research-based teaching side of things. And the lab was initially considered as a space where students could continue to develop digital methods, skills, and thinking and projects outside of the kind of assessment process. The faculty involvement is primarily from the NavCom teaching team, although other people do come in and out of the lab. And our focus is on qualitative feminist STS concerns. Yeah, so our theoretical underpinnings of the lab are kind of around these kind of theoretical areas. Realizing that I'm standing in front of the big screen, so apologies for that. And a lot of our theoretical standpoint comes from the NavCom syllabus. So the NavCom unit does a lot of heavy lifting in our master's program. So our master's program is Digital Innovation and Management. It is not aligned to a particular discipline, which I think is kind of odd sometimes when students graduate out of this program and they can't call themselves a somethingist, but they seem to do fine. So this course that we work on and teach through the lab does a lot of the theoretical lifting for thinking about complex situations in society and mobilizing that through a digital methods approach. So, and then thinking about how we analyze big amounts of data. So thinking about the methodology of analysis through that way. And these are some of the thinkers that we primarily think alongside. So situated knowledge and methods make worlds, we kind of focus on in the first third of the program, digital sociology and digital methods in the second third, and then data feminism and other standpoints on statistics we tend to look at later on in the semester. But those find their influence in the lab, mostly because we teach it, so it's in our brains, but also it's kind of what was the basis of establishing the lab in the first place. It's also kind of worth noting that our relationship with digital methods is in flux. It feels like we have about a yearly conversation about what we talk about when we talk about digital methods. And while we kind of mobilize it in the class from Richard Rogers' University of Amsterdam perspective, where it's a lot about data scraping and making visualizations and that kind of thing, a lot of us don't use those methods on a day-to-day basis. So we're thinking more in terms of ethnography, autoethnography, and kind of, we do think a lot about where the lab's place in digital methods is and what it can contribute to those discussions. We also come from a lot of different countries and disciplinary backgrounds, and I think that informs the work and our conversations. a lot. So we draw on anthropology, sociology, HCI, cultural studies, computer science, software studies, philosophy, and design, but we all kind of come together around these kind of texts and thinkers. So as I mentioned, we work primarily with our MSc students on the Digital Innovation and Management program. And although we've had students from other programs, disciplines, and undergraduate programs join our work, that is the core group that we work with. And you can see in this picture here that this is a lot of our cohort from last year. And just to give you an idea of the reach the lab has in the student community, we currently have just under 150 students enrolled to begin their MSc program with us in August. So it's quite a big cohort in terms of humanities and social sciences that we're dealing with. And in that first semester of the MSc program, the students take Navigating Complexity and another unit called Computational Literacies. And so that means that faculty from the ETHOS Lab have a very hands-on role with the students in their first semester before they go off and select their specializations. And the specializations are public sector, digital transformation, service design, big data, and service economics, which is code word for blockchain, basically. So as I've mentioned, Navigating Complexity is a course which does a lot of the heavy lifting in the MSc program. Our students come from a range of disciplinary backgrounds. Some already have technical knowledge in computing and can code quite confidently, while others come from more theoretical backgrounds or a strong social sciences or philosophical background, while others have vocational skills and are looking to shift into a different career. So we have a lot of students come from the healthcare sector or from a background where they've had a more vocational undergraduate degree, so they're looking to switch gears. But that's been very interesting because we've had in recent years a handful of midwives join our program, and that's led to some really interesting conversations with one of my colleagues, Baki Chakachi. He is interested in how people are assigned numbers or like identification numbers in the welfare state. And in Denmark, midwives are responsible for issuing people with identification numbers. So it's just one of those things where research-based teaching can often become teaching-based research. So it's been really interesting to witness that happen. So as I mentioned, NavCom does this work of introducing students to STS theory, digital methods, and data analysis and visualization. And as part of the course, students do a semester-long group project where they pick an issue or a controversy and do an online data analysis of it. So they might scrape Twitter or they might look at Wikipedia or that kind of thing. And this picture here is of the students' pitch day. So about 6 weeks into term, they make a poster which outlines their research question, their research design, and kind of any questions that they have around that. And instead of a lecture that day, they present their posters and get feedback from not only teaching staff, but people from the lab community and from the broader technologies and practice research group. That means that kind of students have a chance to talk about their research and kind of feel like it's the last check that they can have before they actually start their data scrape in earnest. But those are the kind of things where we're kind of constantly talking about research and the practice of doing research in this program and through the lab. So just to give you an example of some of the projects that students did last year, one group focused on discourse on the Texas Heartbeat Act on Twitter. Others looked at the impact of the big Facebook outages that happened at some point, probably in October last year. But yeah, I just lost my place. So I want to talk a little bit about the picture on the left. So the course is supported by 2 weekly lectures, and one is a traditional auditorium lecture, and the other one takes the form of a live radio program, a talk radio style program. And this is an innovation from the pandemic that we've decided to hold on to because it's fun and it's been quite a good pedagogical experiment as well. So in 2020 in Denmark, in the what was our first semester, what would be second semester time-wise here, or calendar year-wise here, we were able to teach face-to-face for the first 2/3 of that semester. I would say before we were put down into lockdown again. But we kind of had some restrictions around that face-to-face teaching and what it looked like. So we had building capacity restrictions, which meant that one lecture was face-to-face, so our auditorium lecture was face-to-face, and the other lecture had to be online. And we kind of really railed against the idea of just transposing a lecture online because we had been talking about different ways of teaching together, and so we thought, why don't we do something different? And ITU is interesting because I mentioned we have 2 buildings, and we only had 1 building up until 2 years ago. The second building that we got belonged to DR, which is the Danish national broadcaster, and they left behind some of their podcast studios and that kind of thing. So we actually had a purpose-built space to do a radio program, and it was COVID safe because there were so few of us doing that. So we decided to have this talk radio show be where 2 or more of the teaching staff would co-host a show on that week's theme in NavCom and unpack the syllabus in a more detailed and yet informal way, with a way for students to provide or to ask anonymous questions and dig into the text and the theme a bit deeper that way. It also allowed us as teachers to do research-based teaching in a different way. So we were able to talk about our own experiences with things going wrong in our research or talking about best practices. And we found that to be a really interesting way of doing research-based teaching, to be able to be so honest and casual about what it's like to be a researcher and the realities of that. And also kind of addressing some of those things where students will kind of just be like, how are we going to use this in real life? And this format allowed students the ability to actually ask those questions, sometimes in a quite brutal way as well, but it kind of allowed for a different dialogue, not only between teachers, but between teachers and students as well. And I mean, speaking from personal experience, we don't often get to do teaching where we're in dialogue with 2 teaching staff. And I think when we're able to do that, there's some kind of, I don't want to say some kind of magic, but there is something really exciting that happens when you're able to geek out about that with an audience. Maybe it's a captive audience. I think our students really enjoy it anyway. And so moving on from that shape of things in a more, I feel like that's kind of a bit more of an abstract way of considering research-based teaching from the lab, but a more kind of concrete example of that is that the lab is actually providing technical support throughout the group project phase of that unit. So we have our lab TA who gives technical support and tutorials on how to scrape Twitter. We use TCAT, but other options are available, and that kind of thing. So as I mentioned, Marissa, who is here, she also teaches on computational literacies that term, which is a critical look at the history of tech, computing, and coding. And she's been doing some really interesting things about with that, kind of getting students to get their hands on older coding languages such as COBOL to kind of try and get our students out of the mindset that technology is just something that's happened with the internet. There's a far greater genealogy behind that. We also teach a course on organizational change, but we have, that's a relatively recent addition to research-based teaching that we do from the lab, so I don't have much to say about that. And then we also host PhD courses. So in Denmark, PhD fellows are able to create some kind of elements of their taught part of the PhD program. So they're able to suggest courses that they want to take and formulate with faculty members. So in the past 3 years, there's been a course on research interrupted, so how to still go about doing your PhD research during a pandemic when access is restricted. That was such a successful course, and that was run by my colleague Rachel Douglas-Jones, but that was so successful that it was run internationally online, but there were 100 and something applicants that applied to that, and we ran it as both a synchronous and an asynchronous version of that course. And there have also been PhD courses run from the lab on feminist and post-colonial STS. In terms of student-facing activities, throughout the term, we do things that are probably considered extracurricular, so there is no assessment element from them. So we have the Junior Researcher program, which is a program that runs throughout the academic year, where students who have a particular project or interest in mind can apply to do their project hosted in the lab. So throughout that process, they apply to take part in the program, and that program gives them access to mentoring from our lab manager to kind of support them through the process of getting their project off the ground. And then I think 4 times throughout the year, we have pitch and play sessions, which are sessions where faculty come in and the junior researchers are able to do a quick update on where their project is at, and also brainstorm with us about how they can progress their project. So that's one part of the student-facing activities, and some examples of junior researcher program kind of projects from the last few years. So from 2020 through until just the end of this academic year was one group of students went to Greenland to observe digital transformation activities there, and I believe critique it from a post-colonial perspective, because Denmark wants to implement a lot of digital transformation solutions in Greenland, so they wanted to really investigate that further. I think that got interrupted from the pandemic. They were going just before the pandemic. This year we've had an analysis of tech policies in Danish primary schools, which has been really interesting. There's also been another project on women's representation in blockchain communities on LinkedIn. And then the year before last, there was a project on that kind of looked at the role of the hashtag in activism. So that's the kind of flavor of projects that we get from the junior researcher program. And some students choose to turn that into their master's thesis. Others don't. They just do it for the love of it or for personal interest. We also run the Python study group from the lab. So this is a weekly group run during semester where students and staff can learn and develop their skills in Python in a supportive environment. That runs quite often, but this semester just gone, they've also included a talk element of it. So it's not just kind of heads down coding, it's kind of people talking about their experiences of coding in Python and that process of coding where you are continually learning and relearning how to do things. We also have open hours, and these are kind of 2 days a week during the middle of the day, roughly from 10 till 2, where we open the lab for students to drop in, get advice, project support, or just have a cozy space to work from. So just to give you an idea of the space, I would say that the lab probably takes up a space of that third or quarter of the room. It's not a big physical space, but we've managed to fit a lot in. So I also wanted to draw your attention to the library. This is the only library that exists on the ITU campus. During the pandemic, they got rid of a physical library for the entire institution and turned it into a server room. And so we decided, kind of as a response to that, to build our own library of texts that we find relevant to the work we do or that can help us explore our space in the university a bit more. And it's an analog library. You fill in a card and say, I borrowed this, I'll bring it back now. And we also operate on a one in, one out policy. So every time we buy a new book for the library, we have a conversation about which poor book has to leave the collection. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the workshops that we do, and these are more faculty focused. Actually, it's 50-50 faculty and student focused. And we're in the process of starting these back up after a kind of pandemic-induced hiatus. And these usually coincide with visiting speakers, but they don't necessarily have to. So this picture was from a few weeks ago. We had Kat Young-Nicol from the Politics of Patents project at Goldsmiths University of London come past. She gave a lecture about her work, but her work is really interesting in that she is doing work with inventions that have been lodged as patents in the archives. And what she does is goes about a process of investigating what these patents are saying about the problems that people were facing in society when they were written. But then she also recreates these objects in order for people to interrogate the actual object itself. So she came over from London and brought some of the patents and some of the mock-ups of these designs, and they're all wearable designs that she's investigating. So we kind of examined what these patents and what these objects say about society and people's concerns about living in particular societies. And then this picture here is of a workshop that I co-hosted with some colleagues in digital design late last year. We decided to have a look at the smart home through the lens of Joseph Dumet's Implosion, which is kind of a really good way of helping people thinking through devising research questions, or what is it that is particularly interesting to you about this particular object, and how would you like to dig deeper into it? So we looked at smart speakers. There's a group of us who at the university are really interested in smart speakers from different angles. So we got together with some business IT students and some digital design students, and we got them to implode the smart speaker. And what the implosion, or what Dumet talks about when he's talking about the implosion, is this idea that that you can look at things from different dimensions. So a material dimension, a political dimension, a mythological dimension, and on it goes. It's kind of that kind of thing. So we had students look at or kind of come up with questions or trying to understand what they knew without having to. I feel like I'm doing a really poor description of what the implosion is about. It's a 3-step process. Firstly, you interrogate everything you know about a particular object or issue from the top of your head without looking further. So then that enables you to then go and consult other sources for those questions that you continue having. So these students looked at the smart home from, I think, a legal perspective, and then also social perspectives. And then in terms of the lab space, even though we have quite a small space, we have a lot of different bits and pieces in there. So we have the library, which I mentioned. We have a 3D printer and an embroidery machine, which you can kind of code up your own patterns from. So this is a collective pattern of how people were feeling about returning to the physical university space once the pandemic restrictions were lifted in Denmark. So we kind of made this code through Turtle Stitch, which is a web-based embroidery coding tool, and came up with our own pattern. So I think that is, these two are distinct patterns, but then our lab assistant compiled them into one piece, with the idea being that we'd have this collective object which kind of reflected how we were feeling post-lockdown restrictions. We also have the space open as a co-working space, and then we have we're trying to set up a solar-powered web server to run our website. And I think the process of getting that off the ground and getting that up and running has been probably really insightful in terms of research, as the process of just having it up there and kind of saying, well, our website runs as much as the sun is shining. We've kind of run into lots of interesting hurdles with the IT department kind of saying, oh, you can't configure it this way, you need to think about it this way, or not letting us have access to have a static version of our website when we don't have enough sun to run the website. But that process of thinking about how do we make the lab as ecologically minded as possible has been a really interesting thought process, and what that means for our space online as well. In terms of methods, the ETHOS Lab is primarily a space to play with methods, which is why we have a sewing machine and a 3D printer. But these are kind of what we work with. We work with digital methods, we work with role play. So myself and some of our colleagues, we've kind of looked at role-playing games such as Mage to think through how we are placed within the university and kind of how we respond to things within the university. We also think through deletion, removal, and absence. So we kind of, there are a few of us in the lab, particularly my colleagues Rachel Douglas-Jones and Katrina Mel-Gaultier, who work with absent data or deleting data. So those are probably also examples where that really feeds into research-based teaching, because in NavCom we have a lot of students kind of saying, but we don't have a full picture of what's going on here because the API only lets us have X amount of data on certain hashtags. But when we within the lab, we've done a lot of thinking around absence and the role of absence in what we're trying to think about the world and that kind of thing. We also do experimental writing. So one of our colleagues, who is now at Malmö University in Sweden, did a lot of work around monsters and monster writing. So how do we think about objects that unsettle us, or technological innovations that unsettle us? How can we conceive of them as monsters to make them more approachable and interrogate them in different ways? And thinking about how we approach the practice of writing as well. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the role of a feminist STS lab in an IT university. So the IT University's goals are basically to train a lot of students to have roles in the IT industry for the value of Denmark. So that's kind of, those are the goals writ large. We're an institution that exists to train students to go into the IT industry. But I think the role of a feminist STS lab is to make sense of those taken for granted narratives about technology and tech education, and kind of challenge them and kind of say what's going on here, and how can we think differently about what we're doing? Are we just serving a kind of socio-economic role here? Is there something more going on here? We also exist. I've written fairy light diplomacy here. Hear me out. There's the building that we mostly occupy at ITU. So the main building is a glass, steel, concrete. It's a beautiful building, but it's quite a blunt instrument, and it's kind of, there's no kind of sense of hygge or coziness in the building itself. So in one of the sessions where my colleagues did some mage role playing, they kind of were investigating this sense of why does it feel the way it feels? Why does the building feel the way that it feels, quite like a blunt instrument? And one of the things that came out of that was this decision to put up fairy lights in the ceiling of the lab, which then turned into other people putting fairy lights or stringing them up in their offices, and then other people who aren't even associated with the lab putting fairy lights in their offices. So it's a space which kind of says, even though things are configured this way, you can configure them differently and think about them differently. It's also a space for collaboration, and we regularly hold writing or workshop retreats where we suggest things that we want to work on and then kind of explore them together through the normal kind of format of a writing retreat. So we had our last one in April or May, and that was really nice because we were able to just come together, take a day out of the building, and just talk about what we're interested in, and seeing if there were other people who wanted to write and think alongside us. So kind of having that writing activity as a way to start new research. So it's kind of a different approach from saying, oh, here's a phenomenon, I'll just kind of craft a research question and get onto it. It was kind of one of those nice things where one of my colleagues said, I'm really interested in the political economy of technology. And someone else said, oh yes, me too. Let's kind of flesh this thing out and see what avenues there are to pursue this. We also have an ambition to be a space of solidarity and care, especially in this return to face-to-face teaching. This term has been the normal term. I would say that we've been back teaching face-to-face full-time, doing every activity face-to-face. And that's been really exhausting and relentless. And I think we kind of wanted to look at ways that we could show care to one another, even when the institution kind of says, no, just keep working, just keep doing it. Yeah. And as I said, we really aspire for it to be a space for thinking, speculation, and play. And when I say that, I think what we really want is to have that speculation and play be something that we can then fold back into our teaching once it's been refined and thought through even more. We have annual themes, and I feel like they kind of have a shade of irony, especially in the last few years. So I just put a sampling of recent themes to give an idea of what we kind of focus on or kind of focus our thinking around. So 2020's theme was deep time, which I don't think we could have anticipated just how deep time was going to be in 2020. And then in 2021, we wanted to think about limits. That also took a life of its own as the pandemic continued. And then this year we're thinking about cultivating enchantment, and that theme has really allowed us to rethink what we do, who we work with, what we want to achieve, how we want to go about things. So I'm a big fan of themes just for the centering focus. So we also do a lot of projects and publications. These are just a sampling of what we do. So I want to focus on the ethos as a data provider. In the last year or so, we've been collectively thinking about ethos's role as part of an institution and that kind of does data scraping or data gathering on behalf of other people for their projects, and the life that that data takes on afterwards, or the responsibilities that we might want people to show towards that data that they might not if they got it from other sources. So there's been a lot of thinking done around that, and some of my colleagues presented about that at the East conference in Madrid a few weeks ago. The Student Surveillance Project is a really good example of students and our former lab manager working together on a project from the lab. So I think at the beginning of last year, I think some staff or students noticed that Moodle, which is what we run our units from, was kind of gathering, or had the option of gathering certain data on students. So it was kind of that predictive algorithm type stuff. So if a student engages with the platform this much, they're at this kind of risk of failing or that kind of thing. So we got some students together who were affiliated to the lab to kind of think through what that means. One of the things about doing these kind of projects, and that I think we want to work better on, is actually thinking we've only got these collaborations existing with students for the duration of their time at the institution. So a lot of the students that worked on this project with us have just graduated. They're going on to bigger and better things. So it's kind of how do you wrap these projects up in a nice, not a nice neat bow, but kind of a way that they can feel like they've done the work and can be quite proud of it. Yeah. And this is definitely not an exhaustive list. You can kind of have a look on our website and see a bit more. This picture is of our former lab manager and now PhD fellow, Simi, hanging up all of the pictures from a GDPR Erasure Poetry event. So this was before my time at ITU, but they had an event where I think it was a deletion poetry rave was what it was called, where people were invited to get a piece of the GDPR legislation and delete or kind of black out words from their page to create a poem from it. And there have been 2 volumes of poetry published from that. We have some collaborations. We're always looking for more, and they're both kind of internal and external collaborations. And then, yeah, I think because we're in this time of kind of rethinking what it looks like to work together as a lab, these are some of the things that I think we aspire to. So we don't have any PhDs based in the lab, but we would be really interested in having students who want to create new knowledge through methods to join us in the lab and have their project based in the lab. We would like to have collaborations with like-minded research groups and thoughtful collaborations with community groups and third sector organizations. We're not a group that is, I would say, primarily interested in private sector collaborations, although we would probably be open to them. Yeah, and then kind of retaining the space that we have in the broader institution as a space that really focuses on care and well-being and exploring avenues for non-traditional publishing. That was me. I can feel my voice kind of starting to go croaky, so I've been saved by the final slide. But these are kind of some of the details of ETHOS and where you can find out more.